Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this plenary keynote address on human rights in the European Union's foreign policy. I'm Jo Fox. I'm Dean of the School of Advanced Study and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Engagement at the University of London. The School of Advanced Study is very pleased to be co-hosting this exciting global conference on human rights and foreign policy. And I'd like to extend my thanks to all of those partners that have supported this important initiative. We're delighted that this keynote address is open to the public as well, given that public engagement is a major part of our remit here at the school. I'm honoured to welcome and to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mr. Eamon Gilmore. Eamon is European Union Special Representative for Human Rights and Special Envoy for the Columbian Peace Process. He was Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2011 until July 2014. During this time, he led Ireland's successful presidency of the European Union, was President of the EU's General Affairs Council, Chairperson in Office of the OSCE, and managed the Northern Ireland Peace Process on behalf of the Irish government with responsibility for the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, including its core human rights provisions. As a member of the Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, he was an active member for social rights and a champion of the liberal agenda. He played a leading role in the legalisation of contraception and abortion in Ireland and was widely recognised for his part in the successful campaign for same-sex marriage equality. Eamon was a trade union leader and a student union leader prior to his election to Parliament in 1989. He was leader of the Irish Labour Party from 2007 until 2014. In his current role as EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Eamon acts to enhance the European Union's effectiveness, presence, and visibility in protecting and promoting human rights throughout the world. We'll start with an address from our keynote speaker, followed by a Q&A session with our global audience. Participants can post questions using the Q&A button on the Zoom page, and we'll do our very best to get through as many questions as possible in the time we have. Eamon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Jo Fox, and thank you for your very generous introduction. I also want to thank Dr. Corinne Lennox and her colleagues in the Human Rights Consortium for inviting me to speak to you today. And I want to congratulate the organisers of this three-day conference for bringing together so many distinguished scholars to address highly relevant topics on human rights and foreign policy. My only regret is that we cannot all be meeting in person to share the research, the thinking, and the opinion. And I just wonder, do we dare? Do we dare to hope that we are emerging into a new phase of physical meetings again? I've been asked to speak to you about the place of human rights in the foreign policy of the European Union. It's a big topic, but Corinne has obligingly asked me to focus on three aspects. The new EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy from 2020 to 2024, the key tools used by the European Union to promote human rights in its foreign policy, and how EU partnerships in promoting human rights are changing in bilateral and multilateral relations. So let me start by why we have a new action plan on human rights and democracy. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are in the DNA of the European Union. Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union states, the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Article 49 of the treaty makes it a condition for membership of the EU that applicant countries respect those values in Article 2 and commit to promoting them. Article 3, which deals with the European Union's aims, include in its relations with the wider world the objective to contribute to the eradication of poverty and the protection of human rights. And Article 21 requires that the EU's actions in the international scene shall be guided by the principles which have inspired its own creation, development, and enlargement, and which it seeks to advance in the wider world. Democracy, the rule of law, universality and indivisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for human dignity, the principles of equality and solidarity, and respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Now, I'm recalling those provisions of the EU's treaties because they remind us that advancing democracy and respect for human rights are not optional in the EU's foreign policy. They are treaty obligations owing their origins to our history and to our shared values. They are also clearly in our interests. Supporting human rights and democracy is central to furthering the EU's strategic autonomy. More human rights means more freedom, prosperity, peace and security for us all. And that is why every day, in different parts of the world, the European Union and its member states are working for human rights and democracy in practical ways by supporting human rights defenders, sometimes taking them out of danger, observing trials and elections, and working on projects, for example, to advance the rights of women and to support civil society. During the past 5 years, the European Union has helped to protect more than 46,000 human rights defenders at risk. We have deployed 98 election observation missions to help strengthen democratic institutions and build public confidence in electoral processes. Examples include campaign financing in Paraguay and women's political participation in Pakistan. The EU has invested 1.3 billion euros through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, and the next programme, that figure will increase to 1.5 billion euros. 500 million euros has been committed to the Spotlight Initiative to strengthen gender equality and to combat violence against women. We advocated strongly for the abolition of the death penalty, and executions have decreased worldwide by 58% since 2015. We use our trade agreements and our schemes of trade preferences to encourage compliance with key human rights and labour rights conventions. And we invest in human rights education through the funding we provide for the Global Campus, which is centred in Venice, and which draws together a network of 100 universities throughout the world, and whose 3,600 graduates are now working as human rights ambassadors and defenders in international, governmental, and civil society organisations. All of that and more was achieved during the life of the last EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy. The new action plan, covering the period 2020 to 2024, was adopted by the Council unanimously by all of the 27 member states last November, having already gone through extensive consultation and adoption by the Commission in March of last year. It is therefore a truly Team Europe plan, committing all of the institutions and the member states to a coherent and comprehensive framework for the actions that we will collectively take in the world on human rights and democracy up to the end of 2024. The plan is the only one of its kind to be adopted and implemented by any regional organisation. The action plan is built on 5 pillars: protecting and empowering individuals, building resilient, inclusive and democratic societies, promoting a global system for human rights and democracy, the challenges posed and the opportunities offered by new technologies, and delivering by working together. Many of the actions set out in the plan are a continuation, intensification, or a skilling up of work which is already underway, such as on the death penalty and on torture, on freedom of religion or belief, on media freedom and the safety of journalists, on the needs of human rights defenders, on minorities, on persons with disabilities, and on tackling discrimination in all its forms. But there are also new elements which include an enhanced emphasis on economic, social, and cultural rights. Sometimes the EU is perceived by our partners for being somewhat imbalanced in our focus on civil and political rights. It includes a greater emphasis on democracy, particularly relating to the shrinking space for civil society and political action. There's an entire new pillar on technology, which includes how to leverage the benefits of digital technologies to promote human rights while also addressing the risks and challenges. We are putting a greater focus on business and human rights, including issues relating to supply chains and the prospects for due diligence legislation. We are strengthening the links between human rights and the environment, not least because many of the human rights defenders who are put at risk these days are environmental campaigners. And we intend to invest more on promoting what we are doing to advance human rights and democracy. The adoption of this plan, which relates to the EU's foreign policy and external action, is also choreographed with the adoption of several corresponding plans which relate to the health of human rights and democracy within the European Union. I refer in particular to the internal European Democracy Action Plan, the Gender Equality Strategy, the Gender Action Plan, and the European Rule of Law Mechanism, which is intended to identify challenges at an early stage and to help member states find solutions to safeguard and protect the rule of law. Coherence and consistency between what we do externally and internally are vital for our credibility and for our effectiveness, but also as a matter of principle, because human rights are universal and democracy is the best way to protect those rights. Which brings us to the second of Corinne's questions: what are the key tools used by the European Union to promote human rights in its foreign policy? Well, any plan is just a document until it is implemented. And the High Representative and Vice President Joseph Borrell has put a strong emphasis on the need to implement the action plan effectively. For the first time, this action plan contains timelines and provisions for evaluation and review. It also assigns to me, as the European Union Special Representative, a key role for guiding the implementation of the plan. Implementation of the plan is already well underway. One of the first actions taken under this plan was the adoption by the Council in December of the new global human rights sanctions regime. The use by the European Union of sanctions to respond to human rights violations is not new. There are already in place some country-specific sanctions, but the global sanctions regime will enable the member states of the European Union through the Council to impose sanctions on individuals, on entities, and on non-state as well as state actors for violations of human rights anywhere in the world. Since the approval of the global human rights sanctions regime in December, the Council has used this new tool as well as country sanctions for violations in Belarus, China, Russia, Eritrea, North Korea, South Sudan, and Venezuela. The most important work, however, on the implementation of the plan will be undertaken at individual country level. The human rights situation differs from country to country, and therefore, right now, the 140 European Union delegations throughout the world, together with the embassies of our member states in those countries, are drawing up individual country strategies, which will be pursued by both the European Union delegations and the embassies of our member states in each of those countries. Each year, the European Union delegations will report on progress on the implementation of those strategies, and these reports will form the basis of an EU annual report on human rights and democracy in the world. The next such report is expected to be considered by the Foreign Affairs Council later this month. Throughout each year, the European Union delegations and the member states' embassies will engage with governments, national human rights institutes, civil society, human rights defenders, press, and academia about human rights and democracy issues, including elections, legislation, practices, and often individual cases. To give coherence and consistency to this work, the EU has developed guidelines which provide practical guidance to officials in our delegations and for our member state embassies on how to handle particular topics, including torture, children in armed conflict, international humanitarian law, human rights defenders, the death penalty, the rights of the child, violence against women and girls, freedom of religion or belief, protecting the rights of LGBTI people, freedom of expression online and offline, non-discrimination, and most recently, guidelines on safe drinking water and sanitation. Almost all of the 140 EU delegations have dedicated human rights officials who work closely with their counterparts in member states' embassies. And the action plan commits to the training of those officials, and that process is already underway. This diplomatic work at country level informs political engagement with the countries concerned about human rights issues. This is pursued in about 60 cases through formal human rights dialogues, through the high-level meetings between the EU leaderships and the countries concerned, and through my own engagement as special representative with those countries. The political and diplomatic activity is in turn strengthened by the importance of human rights in our trade relationships. Every trade agreement which the EU negotiates with a third country or group of countries contains human rights clauses with provisions for monitoring. The EU also operates a scheme of trade preferences which gives tariff-free access for developing countries to the EU market, provided that those countries ratify and comply with key United Nations conventions on human rights and ILO conventions on labour rights. Again, there is provision for monitoring of those trade preferences, and also for the withdrawal of the trade preferences if necessary. And for example, in 2020, the Council decided to partially withdraw some of the trade preferences in the case of Cambodia. In addition to the financial supports provided through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, which I've already mentioned, the European Union also provides various financial and technical assistance to countries improving their human rights situations through the Foreign Policy Instrument and through development cooperation. These financial supports assist the programs of multilateral bodies such as the OHCHR, the ICC, and the Council of Europe, as well as supporting in-country human rights work such as the strengthening of national human rights institutions and the training of judiciary and police. So let me then move on to the third question that you have put to me relating to the importance of partnership. Our work at bilateral level to promote human rights and democracy is just part of the overall effort. The European Union is committed to multilateralism, and one of the pillars of the action plan is the strengthening of the global system for human rights. The EU is a staunch supporter of the United Nations, including the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the Third Committee in New York, the special procedures and the treaty bodies, and of course, the office and work of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The recent EU communication on multilateralism commits to the holding of a regular strategic dialogue between the European Union and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we are currently preparing for the first of those formal meetings in the autumn, which will be co-chaired by High Commissioner Bachelet and by me. Of course, there is continuing contact and cooperation between the EU and the OHCHR and between the High Commissioner and myself. The European Union delegations in Geneva and New York are very active, often leading on country-specific and thematic issues. For example, when the coup took place in Myanmar in February this year, it was the EU which brought the issue to the Human Rights Council, and long before the fraudulent election in August last, the European Union had been leading on the human rights situation in Belarus. The European Union seeks to develop partnerships on the human rights agenda all across the world. We place a particular emphasis on regional partnership. The African Union and its human rights organs, for example, are very important. We hold an annual human rights dialogue with the African Union, and I've already co-chaired 2 of those. We engage closely with the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, and I had the honor recently of addressing the opening of its last session. And I have spoken recently with Commissioner Bankole of the African Union about our plans for the next EU-AU Human Rights Dialogue. We work closely with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and with ASEAN. We have launched our action plan for human rights and democracy across all 5 regions, Europe and Central Asia, the Americas, Africa, Asia Pacific, and just yesterday, the Middle East and North Africa, in all cases involving representatives of national and regional organizations and civil society. We work closely with the OSCE, and I met just yesterday with the director of the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and of course we work closely with the Council of Europe. All of the EU member states are members of the Council of Europe, and the EU itself is in the process of acceding to the European Convention on Human Rights as required under the Lisbon Treaty, and the negotiations for that accession are currently underway. An important partner for the European Union in our work on human rights and democracy is the United States. Indeed, the summit between the European Union and the United States leaderships, President Biden and Presidents von der Leyen and Michel, is just taking place right next door as I speak. I was pleased that during the last US administration, we restored the formal EU-US consultations on human rights, which had been in abeyance since 2015. And despite sometimes public perception, we had quite a good relationship on human rights issues with the US during that last administration. There were, of course, some important differences. One related to the International Criminal Court. The European Union strongly insists on compliance with international humanitarian law, supports international criminal justice, and is a staunch supporter of the ICC. The United States is not a party to the ICC. That is, of course, their right. But during the Trump administration, the US and others vigorously attacked the ICC, including by the imposition of sanctions on the chief prosecutor and other senior officials of the court. The European Union stood with the ICC during that time, raised the issue with the US administration on several occasions. We have welcomed the decision by the new administration in Washington to lift the sanctions, and the EU will continue its efforts to universalize the Rome Statute and to encourage the remaining 45 countries to become state parties to the ICC so that we have a more effective global criminal justice system to bring war criminals to account. The EU's approach to promoting human rights and democracy in the world is one of partnership and engagement. Every year we hold around 60 human rights dialogues with countries and regional organizations around the globe. Every day our delegations and member states' embassies are pursuing human rights issues in different parts of the world. And in my own role as the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, I've engaged directly with the governments of more than 40 countries since the commencement of my mandate just over 2 years ago, and I have participated in over 140 events of a multilateral nature, as well as close engagement with civil society organizations at international and country levels. There are, however, particular challenges. China has suspended its human rights dialogue with the European Union following the recent imposition of EU sanctions on some Chinese officials relating to the situation of the Uyghur population. Russia has not seriously engaged with the EU on human rights since 2014. There is no substitute for direct engagement, and I intend to continue my efforts to ensure that meaningful discussions are resumed. These are difficult times for human rights and democracy in the world. For some time, we've been seeing and experiencing direct challenges to the very idea that human rights are universal and indivisible. We're seeing pushback on the rights of women, more limitation in the space for civil society, growing restrictions on freedoms of assembly and expression, and unnecessary risks and increasing risks for human rights defenders and journalists. The COVID pandemic, which has magnified almost every existing inequality in our society, has created new human rights problems and further agitated the pre-existing. Authoritarianism is on the rise. The recent report for VDEM, Varieties of Democracy, says that 87 of the countries in the world, representing 68% of the world's population, are now either closed or electoral autocracies, and that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen, if there is such a thing, in 2020 is down to levels last seen around 1990. The struggle for human rights and democracy is therefore a daily one. In Belarus, where the people struggle for democracy in the face of state repression, in Myanmar, where the military has overthrown the democratically elected government, the Rohingya people continue to suffer, in Tigray, where violence continues and humanitarian needs grow, and in several parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, on every continent, there are several examples of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. The EU Action Plan is a renewed commitment by the European Union to address these challenges. It is also an opportunity to do so in a more proactive way. But we cannot do it alone. We work with like-minded partners, including the United Kingdom. We support the UN system and the international institutions who defend and promote human rights, and we seek to engage with partner countries around the world, including those with whom we disagree. In doing so, we never seek to promote human rights and democracy as European values. They are universal values which the EU supports. Indeed, human rights are not the property of any one country, group of countries, regional or international organization, they belong to people everywhere, on every continent, and no matter what the political system. One of the great lessons of the COVID crisis is that people everywhere are essentially the same, with the same vulnerabilities, same basic needs, and yes, the same human rights. In my own engagement with governments and authorities and civil society around the globe, I often draw on my own personal experience in my own country of Ireland. When, for example, I meet resistance to LGBT rights, I recall standing in the courtyard of Dublin Castle 6 years ago in 2015, as Ireland became the first country in the world to approve same-sex marriage equality by popular vote in a referendum. But I also recall being a member of the Irish Parliament only 30 years previously that decriminalised homosexual acts. And on the death penalty, I also remembered when we as an Irish Parliament abolished it in law in the early 1990s, so I know the arguments. And similarly on the rights of women, particularly in relation to sexual and reproductive health. So our engagement with countries and societies around the world cannot be one of seeking to impose, but to encourage and to support others to walk the same path that we in Europe have, with some difficulty, already walked ourselves, and some of it only relatively recently. And also to acknowledge that when it comes to human rights, no country is perfect, and democracy is still a work in progress. And that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was itself a consequence of the horrors which were perpetrated mainly on the continent of Europe and by Europeans in the earlier part of the 20th century. In our work to promote human rights and democracy, partnership is not only with governments and international bodies. The role of civil society is crucial, and the EU engages continuously with civil society at country, regional, and here in Brussels. For every human rights dialogue, we consult formally with civil society, and each year we hold an NGO forum, the most recent of which was held virtually in December and concentrated on human rights and technology. But partnerships on human rights are widening and should widen. We're seeing new initiatives in sports and the arts, and of particular significance is a growing interest in the private sector to engage with due diligence in the supply chain and to be aware of the responsibility of business for human rights. This is not surprising, since all over the world, individuals, many of them informed by new means of communication, are becoming more aware of and sensitive to the issues of human rights. The economic power of the individual consumer, the awareness of the individual citizen, these are among the new forces for good and for progress on human rights issues. Despite the many challenges, I'm optimistic, but also realistic about the prospects for progress on the human rights and democracy agenda in the EU's foreign policy and external action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eamon. I mean, it's truly extraordinary that the scope and scale of the activity in this area. And you've mentioned already that this is quite a diplomatically active time. So we have some questions about what's going on in that area now. And I'd like to just ask two sort of related questions. One is how the EU's position on China and human rights aligns with recent statements at the G7 and NATO. And also how EU priorities align with the priorities of the new Biden administration on human rights. Are there gaps in US priorities that the EU would like to see addressed? You mentioned the International Criminal Court as a potential area of convergence. So perhaps we might start with those two questions.
Well, first of all, clearly there are major human rights issues that we have to discuss with China, and that we do when we have the opportunity. And I said we did have a human rights dialogue with China, but that is now suspended. Issues include, for example, what is happening in Hong Kong, the situation in Xinjiang, the position of the Uyghurs, Tibet, issues relating to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and so on. The relationship with China is a very important relationship for the European Union. Engagement with China is important for a whole range of reasons, not least the urgent need to address global issues such as climate change. Human rights is an area where there are significant disagreements with China. That will, I think, continue to be the case, certainly for some time. But human rights will be part of the European Union's engagement with China. I hope that as far as our direct engagement on human rights is concerned, that the position will be restored, that the human rights dialogue will be restored, and that indeed, if anything, that we will have a deeper and more political engagement with China on those issues. In relation to the United States, we have already been talking with the United States administration about human rights issues. We welcome the initiative which the United States administration is taking to have a summit for democracy. And we will certainly cooperate and participate in that event. And we talk, of course, about many of the human rights challenges which are faced around the world. The ICC is an area where there are differences. We're glad that they've withdrawn the sanctions. The sanctions were, I mean, sanctions are something that should be used for people who are perpetrators of human rights violations, not for those who are investigating. So we're glad that the United States has withdrawn that. They're not a state party to the ICC, but they are committed. And we've talked about this to the pursuit of international criminal justice, to bringing war criminals to justice, and to strengthening that. And we will continue to have that ongoing discussion with the United States. I've had myself a number of discussions with the coordinator in the National Security Council for human rights, the acting assistant secretary who's responsible for human rights, labour and democracy. And I hope to meet with the new assistant secretary when confirmed.
Thank you, Eamon. While we're on the ICC, we have a specific question about whether the whether the EU will support an ICC prosecution of the Philippine president for crimes against humanity.
Well, our view, our approach to the ICC is that it is independent, that it makes its own decisions. We don't comment so much on individual cases or individual investigations that it is conducting. That's a matter for the court. We respect its independence, and we will continue to respect its independence. And we have consistently supported its right to pursue investigations and to bring cases to trial when it feels that that's appropriate.
So we have another question. That last month, the UN's Intergovernmental Working Group on the Right to Development began the process of considering a draft convention on the right to development. And the EU's position is that it doesn't support a legally binding instrument at this time. But there's some question over why. You know, it's not entirely clear as to why the EU is opposed. And perhaps you could elaborate on what the EU's objections are to that draft constitution.
Well, I think we have to look at this. I mean, first of all, in respect of development, of course, the European Union is strongly committed to development throughout the world. In fact, when one takes the contribution that the European Union and its member states make, we are in fact by far the biggest contributor to development cooperation throughout the world. So there can be no question about our commitment in that respect. We are, however, concerned about the politicization of the issue of development as it relates to human rights. The whole question about that development must come first and human rights come later, because we see that human rights are indivisible, that they're interrelated. So our reluctance is born of that concern. Obviously, it is something that we will remain very closely engaged with, and we'll continue to discuss the issue with partners.
Thank you. Another question coming in from our audience today. What kind of smart strategies can the EU use to bypass the contestations of its positions and potential leadership at the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, I don't think there are, I don't think it's a case of using smart strategies. I think it's a case of continuing to engage with partners, of continuing to talk very closely, particularly with those who disagree with us. The situation does change. I remember when I took on this role, one of the things that I was told at the time was that, for example, on Belarus, we used to have a regular resolution on Belarus, and one of the points that was made to me at the time was that, there seemed to be a degree of fatigue, I think, among some Human Rights Council about the issue. There's no fatigue now, and I think the relevance of the European Union having consistent positions and continuing to put these forward at the Human Rights Council and to engage with partners on them, I think is clearly seen, and that's just one example of it.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on some discussions that have been going on in some of the panels around the conference. And in a panel yesterday, it was noted that quite often sanctions don't work in changing policies towards human rights, and may actually in some circumstances backfire. So how does the EU go about balancing the positives and negatives of sanctions?
Well, I think it's important that we don't see sanctions as a panacea. Sanctions is just one tool among many that we use. We have decided that we are going to use it more widely. Up until the adoption of the global human rights sanctions regime, the use of sanctions followed a pattern that there was a country situation. For example, Russia following what happened in Crimea in 2014, or Myanmar, for example, and where we could impose sanctions on the country for human rights violations. But it required, first of all, the adoption of a country sanctions, and then the human rights sanctions follow. So now the global human rights sanctions regime will allow us to do it anywhere in the world, and what will drive it will be the scale, I suppose, of the human rights violations. But sanctions are not the only tool that we use. We use the diplomatic and political, persuasion, engagement, encouragement, supporting countries which are making improvement in, there is no country that will do an overnight transformation in its human rights situation. It's gradual, sometimes it's very slow. And so we encourage and we continue to support that. And then, of course, we use, as I said, a political weight. That's where the leadership of the European Union itself, but also the leaderships of member states are engaging with countries, and they're informed, as I've said earlier, by our reports on the human rights situation on the ground. Human rights is generally part of all of those discussions. And then the trade relationship, the European Union market of almost 450 million people, big market. Countries want access to it. We have tariff-free access for countries which are developing, but it's conditional. It's conditional on compliance with UN conventions on human rights, with labour rights, and we do see practical evidence that works. That countries which enjoy those preferences do want to keep them for obvious reasons. And of course, in our trade agreements, we also have standard human rights clauses which we follow up and which we monitor. So it's a mix of all of those, as well as, of course, the work that we do in the multilateral forum.
Thank you, Eamon. We've already talked a little bit about China and Russia and Myanmar, and I'd like to come back to Myanmar again in a moment. But I wonder whether you might comment on the EU's position on the most recent conflict in Israel and Palestine. How can the EU play a constructive role in securing human rights compliance?
Well, first of all, can I say that we are glad that the ceasefire, the end of cessation of violence, which was negotiated by Egypt, that has been put in place, and we'll continue to support that. We have been working on the Israel-Palestine situation for a very long time. We're part of the quartet. We have a special representative. I have a colleague who's a special representative who's particularly dedicated to the Middle East peace process, and who is working on that, and whom I will meet next week, actually, to discuss some issues that we need to pursue from the human rights perspective. we were very concerned about what happened in recent weeks. The High Representative spoke about that on several occasions. The Foreign Affairs Council was engaged with the issue. We'll obviously work now with the new government in Israel, and of course with the Palestinian Authority and with other partner countries to make the contribution that we can make to bringing about a lasting settlement to the situation in the Middle East.
Thanks, Eamon. I said I'd come back to Myanmar, and one of our participants today would like to know why the EU has maintained Myanmar's everything but arms privileges, despite having already made a suspension warning even before the military coup.
Well, first of all, we do have what we call an enhanced engagement on the trade preferences with Myanmar. And that's ongoing. We are always conscious of the effect of withdrawing trade preferences and who will be impacted by that. And in the case of Myanmar, one of the concerns that we have is the impact on the 500,000 or so, mainly women workers in the garment industry who might be affected by that. We have adopted recently sanctions in relation to Myanmar. We have focused those sanctions on those who've had a responsibility for the coup and the subsequent repression. We are looking at the situation of those entities that have close ties with the military in Myanmar. We have not recognized the military government, and we have engaged with elected representatives in Myanmar, including representatives of the National Unity Government. Indeed, I met with a representative of that government in recent weeks.
I'm just coming back into some of the themes of the conference again. There was a panel yesterday on Syria and human rights accountability, and it highlighted that some EU states are using universal jurisdiction to prosecute crimes like torture from that conflict. What's the EU's external action priorities in combating impunity in the Syrian conflict?
Well, first of all, I'm certainly very pleased that a number of member states are using those means to bring those who are responsible for various actions in Syria to bring them to account. We have continued to advocate the use of international mechanisms for accountability in Syria. As I said earlier, we continue to promote the universalization of the Rome Statute, support for the ICC and for the work that it is doing, and in particular for the international mechanisms that have been established in relation to Syria. I think more widely, I think that we have to be very clear, and we are very clear, that violations of international humanitarian law, the atrocities which occur during conflicts which occurred in Syria, that there has to be accountability for them. I think the encouraging thing is that I think we are looking, as we look at the world in the period ahead, I think that we are looking at a world where it is going to be increasingly difficult to get away with these crimes. These are crimes, and it is going to be increasingly difficult to get away with these crimes because of the use of technology, because of the developments in forensic science and in the accumulation of evidence. And indeed, we're seeing that. If you look at the work, for example, that the ICC is doing, if you look at the work, for example, that bodies like the International Commission for Missing Persons is doing, I think we're seeing, if you look, for example, even at some of the cases related to the Balkans, that no matter how long it goes, those who are responsible for atrocities will eventually be brought to justice.
Eamon, I've got two more questions. One bit more specific, one quite a lot wider. First is, will there be other economic, social and cultural rights related EU guidelines other than on water and sanitation in the near future?
Yes, I expect that there will be. I think that the the guidelines on drinking water and sanitation obviously are very important, but I think they do signal, as the action plan also makes clear, that there will be an increased emphasis on economic, social and cultural rights. So I think you can expect to see more activity and more guidelines in that area.
Thank you. Final question. It's part of the bigger, wider societal and cultural debate, and that is around how the EU is integrating a consideration of the human rights violation of colonialism and its legacies into its present foreign policy.
Well, I think you have to think of the European Union as, I suppose, the product of conflict. It emerged from the horrors of the Second World War. It was part of the determination, including by European states at that time, that it should never be allowed to happen again. And I think if we look around the world, and you mentioned, for example, in your introduction, the role that I play as a double hat, if you like, in relation to the peace process in Colombia, I've always been impressed at the inspiration that the European Union is for countries outside of Europe who see, these were countries which fought each other, and many had internal conflicts also through the 20th century, and yet have managed to come together. It's an extraordinary achievement in many ways. 27 countries come together and can do so much together, including in the promotion of peace. I think in respect of not every European country, of course, had a colonial legacy. I come from a country which was more a victim of colonialism than a perpetrator. So it doesn't apply to every country, but I think that generally speaking, in our relationship with countries outside of the European continent, I think that we have to be, quite modest, and I think also a degree of humility. And I think that humility is in part about the very troubled history that Europe had, certainly in the 20th century, but as well before that. And I think that what we are trying to do in the world of the 21st century, which is to promote these values, and that the values on which the European Union is founded, I think is, if you like, this is the new Europe. This is the Europe of today. Yes, we have a lot to do and a lot of ground to make up for some of the sins of the past.
I think that's a good note on which to close, Eamon. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for sharing with this group all of the work that the EU is doing in this area. And I think there will be so many points of connection for the conference participants. We can already see in the questions the way in which what you've been talking about today has connected with some of the panels that took place yesterday. And I think that there'll be more connections as the conference develops. So all that remains for me to do is to thank all of our participants today for their fantastic questions and engagement with this keynote session, and in particular to thank you, Eamon, for your time to talk to us today. It was a fascinating insight into what the EU is doing. So thank you so much, and I hope that the conference continues to go well.